Hello and welcome to another episode of Lunch and Crunch, where we talk about our lunch and we talk about our crunch. I,
I hope
I
you can hear us.
hope you can hear us. Yes, otherwise you're screaming into the void, which is,
Par for the course.
right. Not unsurprising, all things considered.
No.
Um, and today we're going to talk about crunch specifically. Actually, we're going to talk a bit about statistics and mechanics and kind of how those interlink and how there's a little more kind of art to mechanics than perhaps some people realize. It's not all science, if you will. But before I get going, I want to ask my lovely co-host Danielle what she's having for lunch today.
Later after the show, I'll probably be having chicken as a trash. But right now, I'm having some cheese and sausage because I didn't have breakfast. I'm having a snack.
Snack.
Snack. So it's more like snack and crunch, but whatever. Um,
The crunchy
but I
snacks.
have, but I have to tell you about this cheese that I'm eating.
Okay.
So, a couple of weeks ago, I went to Oregon for a one day,
Mm-hmm.
for one whole day. I was in Oregon. And I spent some time in the airport. And I didn't realize that Tillamook is made in Oregon,
Okay.
Tillamook cheese. And I love Tillamook cheese. And so there was a like Tillamook store in the airport.
Oh.
And I was like, oh, hello, store full of cheese. I am indeed a white person. I'm going to get some cheese.
The trap is sprung.
It is a trap, yes. Uh, if you ever want to capture me, just lay out some cheese. Uh,
Same though.
So so I bought a cheese. So they had all these like special reserve aged cheeses.
Mm-hmm.
So I bought a cheese from 2012. So it is a 10-year-old cheese.
Wow.
And it's a cheddar, it's a white cheddar. And I swear this thing has a mouth feel and looks like a Parmesan.
Really? It's a harder cheese?
Well, it's like a soft Parmesan.
Okay.
So it's got the crystals like a Parmesan does,
Mm-hmm.
but it's soft and it like melts in your mouth, but it's also crumbly when you cut it up.
Wild. It sounds
It's it's
amazing, but it's it's
it's
it's hard to
wild and
picture.
it's oh yeah, I mean, I can kind of show you my plate. See this like crumbly looking cheese?
Yeah.
That's it.
Okay.
And it's amazing. Oh my God, it's so good. I can't sing its praises enough. So that's my snack today.
That
Chicken
sounds good.
nuggets are not nearly as interesting to talk about.
And also some chicken nuggets, I guess. Whatever.
Yeah, yeah. Later I'll eat, like a trash panda. So,
Nice. What about your tea?
so my tea today is another tea from Harney and Sons, and it is called Paris,
Ooh.
which does nothing to explain what's in it.
Right. It's like noun.
Yeah. So, Paris is kind of a fruitier tea. It's a black tea. Most of my teas will be black teas.
Mm-hmm.
But it's got hints of bergamot and black currant, but it also has some like vanilla and caramel hints.
Oh, okay.
Now, of course, the bergamot is kind of the dominant flavor because bergamot is just a really overpowering
Oh, yeah. No,
flavor.
it'll punch through most anything.
Right. But when you add cream to this tea, it brings out the vanilla and caramel hints.
Oh, okay.
And so this is one of the teas that I drink with cream, because it makes it kind of just this like really rich, um, soothing tea. It's probably my favorite tea right now, of all of my teas that I drink.
It does sound really, really great.
Yeah, I recommend it if anybody go get themselves a little tin, Harney and Son. Their teas are not expensive, so
Honestly, I'm finding that a lot of the kind of smaller tea shops usually have pretty reasonable prices for really fantastic tea.
yeah.
So excellent.
So What are you having for lunch today?
So I already ate beforehand because I was hungry. And there's a time difference between us in case it's not clear to people watching, so that's why I post lunch and Danielle is pre lunch. But I did have your comments a couple episodes ago about adult Lunchables got me thinking it's been a while since I had a charcuterie plate, so I kind of made one up. I got some wheat crackers. They're basically Triscuits but nicer.
Mm.
And then a nice kind of sharper white cheddar slices. And then we had some extra prosciutto just in the fridge that no one's using. So I was like,
Some prosciutto lying around.
yeah, just,
You know how bougie that sounds, right?
well, you're not wrong, first of all. But my roommate, David, they like to cook often, but sometimes every once in a while a dish won't work out or they're just not feeling it. So they'll buy ingredients for an intended dish that then doesn't come to be. And so they were planning to make a meal involving the prosciutto, and it just never happened. So it's like, use it for sandwiches. Or I was like, you don't really use prosciutto for sandwiches, I don't think. But okay. I mean, I'm sure there is.
But you could just freaking eat it.
Right. So just rip it up and put it on top of the crackers, and it sounds very elegant, but in fact it was just random leftovers in my fridge.
I mean, that's usually how I make a charcuterie board, honestly.
It's the, oh man, I should eat this cheese before it goes bad. Okay, well, I guess I have some crackers. There we go. We'll figure something out. And then my tea, I may have talked about this before, but it's a Palace Elixir from D&T. It's a green tea base, but it also has some white tea and also hibiscus and blueberries.
Ooh,
So
that
it's,
sounds very lovely.
yeah, it's a nice flowery tea. And I normally don't like a lot of really heavy flowery teas, but the green tea is kind of the stronger flavor, so I think it kind of helps anchor it more. And then you just get these little notes of the hibiscus, the blueberries, and jasmine. And so there's little bits of floral, like heavily floral teas. I just feel like I'm drinking a bouquet, and I think it's too much for me personally.
Oh yeah, I'm not a huge fan of strong floral flavors. So, but that sounds lovely. I
Hmm.
do like a lavender or hibiscus tea.
Hmm.
Um, so having those hints in there, like those are some flavors that I like. So I might check that out.
Yeah, I'm trying to slowly move away from just black teas. I
Hmm.
mean, I'm like you. I think I prefer black tea in general. So like my go-to is going to be some form of black tea. But as we partially from doing this, but also just over the course of the pandemic, it's like let me try other teas. And so green has been another increasing go-to, and this is a nice balance of green to kind of springboard me into some of those other flavors.
Sure, yeah,
Indeed. Uh,
excellent.
so I think to kind of start, I know there are a lot of designers who either don't think at all about statistical math for dice probabilities is really what we're talking about a lot here. Either
Right.
don't think about it or get overwhelmed because it feels complicated. So I was thinking maybe we can kind of start with some real basic kind of statistical math to give people a sense of the things you think about, or at least we tend to think about when we're working on games.
Yeah, and everything we're gonna say today, I'm gonna kind of caveat is, you know, somebody else
Mm.
has already thought of most of this stuff for you.
Oh yeah.
So it's stuff that we talk about sometimes, but uh, it's easy to find this information just out there on the internet or somewhere. You don't have to be good at math to understand the concepts that we're talking about right now.
Agreed.
And you don't have to be good at statistics. Like, I enjoy that kind of stuff,
Hmm.
but some basic understanding will help you without having to do the math yourself.
Right. Yep.
So, I see some really basic stuff to talk about are uh, what what your dice curve looks like.
Hmm.
And so when we talk about a dice curve, we talk about probability. If you were to chart how often you're going to get a a single number on a die roll
Hmm.
and what the likelihood out of, say, 100 rolls would look like. If you are rolling a single die, it doesn't matter what that die is. If you're rolling a single die, it's going to be a flat line because the likelihood that you'll roll one number on that die is exactly the same as the likelihood that you'll roll any other number on that die.
Right.
And so if you modify your number, say you're rolling a single d20, that probability is you have the same 5% chance of getting any number that you do of getting any other number. The likelihood of rolling a 20 is exactly the same as the likelihood of rolling a 1.
Right.
And so if you're rolling a single die and then adding a number to it, that number doesn't actually change the probability of getting the number you need. But what it does is if you set a target number of 10, now you have a 5% chance of rolling a 10, and everything above that 10 is also a 5% rate. So rolling above a 10, now this starts to look like a line, but it's an angle. So the average there is that you're going to succeed 50% of the time,
Right.
but every single time you roll, you still have a 5% chance, or higher than that, of rolling below a 10. You have the exact same chance of rolling below a 10 that you do of rolling above a 10.
Right. So you're not changing the probability of a particular number coming up. When you're adding numbers, all you're doing is increasing the number of outcomes that fit within the parameters of this is a successful roll.
Right. Which is good, but it still means that every time you roll the die, you have the same chance of rolling one number as you do as any other. And so you wind up with a line. Then the other kind of curve you can have is a bell curve. So bell curve is where the higher or lowest numbers are on the very end. They're less likely to come up. And the middle numbers are higher. So it kind of creates what looks like a bell. And I know this sounds really simplistic and people are like, yeah, Dee, I know what a bell curve is. But I want people to understand that this is statistics. Like it may seem simplistic, but the statistics of a bell curve is anytime you roll 2 dice, no matter what those 2 dice are, you end up with a really nice looking bell curve. And in fact, other dice pools will also give you bell curves as well. But, the math on, say, 2d6 is really well known.
Yep.
It's really well known because the game Craps runs on 2d6, and people who gamble are really good at knowing their odds.
Yep.
And so, the 7 is the most likely number that's going to come up because there's a bunch of different dice combinations that create a 7, where the 2 and the 12 are least likely to come up because there's only a single combination of dice that will get a 2 and a single combination of dice that'll get a 12. So those are, that is how your curve is created.
Right.
Sounds really complicated, but maybe it sounds simple. I don't know, but it goes into understanding, when we start talking later about mechanics, it goes into understanding likelihoods.
Right. And I mean, I think it's worth spelling stuff out because some people may just be not familiar with these concepts. They may kind of subconsciously understand a 7's more likely to show up than other numbers, but they do not realize that there's concepts behind it. But also, it helps to understand just that flat versus bell curve probability changes things. So if you add a +1 to a roll, say, a +1 to a roll in 5e to that d20 roll, like you said, all it does is increase the number of options of what considered to be a success. but the inherent probabilities of the roll don't really change. Whereas if you add a +1 to a roll in, like, say, Powered by the Apocalypse games, which uses a 2 dice 6 curve, if a +1 pushes you from a 6 to a 7, that's a huge jump, because you're now pushing to a much more favorable outcome. So it's flat in the sense of it increases probabilities, but also the range of probabilities it's increasing to include can really change. Getting that 7 into the curve, or into the range, is a huge benefit. Whereas if you're at if you're +1 and you're adding a +1 to like a 2 or a 3, it's nice, but the range you're including is such a shallow end of that curve that it's not mathematically giving you a whole bunch of power. So there is some tweaking to think about of, like, okay, what is the range? And to, again, use Power by Apocalypse for a moment, their success criteria are pretty rock solid, which is that 7-9 is a partial success, 10+ is a full success. And that's intentional, because, like, that means that on average, you're probably going to get something that resembles a success, which is what the game wants to do. And generally speaking, odds are pretty good you get something that resembles success, but that success is going to be a success with problems of some form, not quite the full success you wanted. Whereas if you have a bunch of modifiers to add into a roll, then you're pretty consistently going to hit. If you have a 3 to your roll, then that means that 7 on average is going to get you a 10, which means you get a full success if you're a very competent character. So that math is all really well thought out, but it's invisible if you just go, okay, +2, +3. I mean, I know +3 is nice, but realizing, oh, okay, a +3 to an average 7 roll gets me a 10, so +2 is not quite as nice. That move from 2 to 3 is a pretty big bump, because it means on average I'm moving from a partial to a full success, whereas a +1 and +2 isn't quite as meaningful.
Yeah, the +1 and +2 is moving you from maybe not a success at all to a success.
Mm-hmm.
Where the +3 is definitely giving you giving you more chances to have the full success.
Mm-hmm.
Just in general. And it's interesting because that math is rock solid and it's such an intentional design that I think a lot of people, like you say, don't think about, which is that the design for Powered by the Apocalypse is success with consequence.
Mm-hmm.
That's what they want you. That's where they want you to sit. And the design is intentional because that's what drives the story forward. That's what, every time you have a success with consequence, you succeed, but you have some drawback, or, it's not a drawback. You only get one of the things you were trying to get, or you only pick one, or, if you're in a fight, maybe you also take damage or something. But every time you roll the dice, you're driving the story forward by having your action create some kind of reaction every single time. It's also
Right.
why the NPCs rarely ever roll in Powered by the Apocalypse. Your action dictates what happens to them and what they do back to you.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's easy to do that when the average is a success with consequence.
Right. If the game master roll of the same probability as players, that means that NPCs would be succeeding roughly equal amount with player characters in a much more push and pull, but by moving that to only players roll, then NPCs are losing at the equal rate that player characters are winning, so that way there's a pretty consistent level of competence. It's a different way of expressing competence, whereas we do in Storypath, where we just give you successes.
Mm-hmm.
And talking about kind of unwitting realizations about probability, 2d6 is one of the most common configurations for tabletop board games, classic tabletop board games. And so things like the Monopoly board, a lot of people don't realize, is that there are 9 spaces on each side. So the math is put out to, generally speaking, you're going to be hitting each of the sides of those boards once per turn. So every 4 turns, you're making a loop around the board. And so you're hitting generally I think it's 3.2 properties per round around the board, which means you're spending money or buying a property, and then that 4th time around, you're getting a little bit of cash back. And that's a pretty solid design when used as written without using house rules. so that the amount of money going out of your pockets is only slightly offset by the amount coming in. So it is a pretty steady trend downward, but it feels like you're getting these little bumps of income back that collect $200 for pass and go. The occasional influx from like other people's rent or from things like chance cards. It makes you want to stay in the game. It's gambling thing. It's like, I got a little bit of money, so I need to keep investing in this to try to make that money bigger, which is the whole point of Monopoly, is that ebb and flow of your fortunes. But it's done in such a way that eventually, all things being equal, you're going to spiral down. So generally, it funnels towards one person ending up getting all of your cash. And that, again, that's the point of the game. So if that board had been smaller, if it had been less spaces, you make those spaces run faster, then it would still be a downward trend, but it would be a lot less steep, and the game would take longer. If there are more spaces, then it's a much sharper decline down. So messing with the amount of spaces on the board really does change things. Chutes and ladders the same way. It's like the way chutes and ladders set up is that you're generally going to hit one chute in one ladder or one snake in one ladder, depending if you're in Europe, roughly per game. So, I mean, you get that bump up and that bump down experience at least once throughout the game. Which, again, that's the point of the game. You want that kind of, I was almost in front when I fell backwards, or I was falling behind and I'd shoot up. So, but that's not like hard statistical modeling, right? This is just kind of, okay, well, the curve keeps here, so let's play with numbers around the space of 7, and how does that change the gameplay?
Right, exactly. So you still get a bell curve when you roll any set of dice that is multiples.
Mm-hmm.
So when we look at our own games, which are dice pools of D10s, we're still getting a bell curve. It's just the averages on the bell curve are less set, like 2d6. Like I can tell you, the middle of that, the very peak of that bell curve is a 7.
Right.
I don't have to think about it because somebody else did that math,
Right.
and I just know that answer. But if you ask me what that center line is on 10d10, I don't know.
Right.
It's some number.
We could find
Maybe
it,
it's
but
5. I don't know, like 10d10, and then the question is, are we adding those numbers together?
right.
Probably not, right? We're looking at in our games, we're looking at a target number, so 8, 7, something like that, and so the math for that shakes out a little differently.
Mm-hmm.
So we've done the math for our own games, and we can reveal to you
Yes, we had
that
the
yes,
secrets.
the secret that on uh, D10s with a target number of 8, um, you're gonna hit that 8 on it takes about 3 dice to, I think it's like an 80% chance of success. It's not 100% clearly because it's never
Right, because it's 30%
100%.
chance per die, because you would get 3 of the
Right.
10 faces that are valuable to you, so that's 30% chance per die, which means that of
Right.
3 dice, you're going to get to 90%, which means eyeball 1, 3.
Right. So it's a pretty much guarantee. You're over 50% chance at 2 dice, but you're well over 50% chance at 3 dice, which is pretty much guaranteed 1 success on 3 dice.
Mm-hmm.
And the more dice you add, the more you're guaranteed to get at least 1 success, in that sense of you could always roll nothing but ones.
Mm-hmm.
There's still that chance on each individual die is still a 10% chance you're going to roll a 1.
Right.
But because you're rolling so many at once, your odds are more in your favor that you're going to get your target number.
Mm-hmm.
The more dice you add, the more you're going to be in that range. So if you look at the numbers that characters have for starting characters and the averages that characters have, they're actually less, especially in Storypath, uh, characters with a good stat can usually start with a 6-7 in like an added together attribute plus skill, which kind of before they even start adding things like enhancement, give them on average when they're rolling, they're probably going to get at least 2 successes. Now, clearly, this talk about dice probability. We're talking about probabilities. I can't guarantee what your dice are going to do.
Right.
You can't guarantee what your dice are going to do. I know.
Well, I mean,
I
you
know people.
can, but it's called cheating.
Right. Yeah, I know people who have like lots of superstitions on how to make their dice do what they want them to do, like yelling at them, sticking them in timeout if they're not doing it right.
Yes. Throw them a certain way on the table. Yeah.
Right. So, we're talking about probability here. So, and that's all we can base it on. So the math for Storypath is based around the idea that your good roll, the thing that you're best at, you're going to probably average 2, maybe 3 successes, depending on how much you're stacked in it. And then the thing that you're worst at, you're probably still going to average 1 success. You're probably still going to have at least 3 dice in the thing that you're worst at. And you may only have like 1 or 2 dice in that thing. But the math is, if you're a well-rounded character, you're going to have, on average, 2 to 3 successes for the thing you're good at, and maybe 1 success for the thing you're not good at.
Right.
And we talk about that in way of successes because we want our difficulties to match competence. In Storypath, we designed it to be for the characters to feel competent, to feel like they're succeeding more often than they're not. And so we make sure that the difficulties, the standard difficulty, the it's not that hard, you're probably going to succeed, is difficulty 1. Because even on your bad roll, you're probably going to get 1 success. You're probably going to be able to do the thing, even for a thing that you're not very good at. And that's important because we want that to be true. And what we want is for people to have extra successes beyond that on their really good rolls so that they can use them to do things like buy stunts or buy off complications.
Right. And to kind of take a slight detour, this is one of the reasons why Onyx Path has moved to firm or firmer difficulty numbers over, say, storyteller or storytelling. Because in the original storyteller and storytelling systems, well, I'm sorry, storytelling never had shifting difficulty. Storyteller did. And so you could go anywhere from 3 to 10 was the original range. And 9 and 10 are really bad difficulty numbers. Like 10 is basically a coin flip, at that point. Because simultaneously, these games also have the rule of 1s cancel out successes. So by having difficulty 10, if you roll 10 and a 1, it's basically 0. So you're just as likely to botch and fail as you were to succeed. And at particularly high dice pulls, difficulty 10, you're actually statistically more likely to do something horribly wrong than to succeed. So it would feel like, I have lots of dice, difficulty 10 should be easy, but the way the math works is actually worse for you. And that was interesting because working on V20 is something Justin and I both knew is, we need to just write out difficulty 10. And there was no elegant way to do it, so it was just a sidebar saying, don't use this number, and here's why. And we got some pushback because people were very much used to, this is an option that I should be able to exercise. But it's like, now we're moving into the area where, because some of this math, like we said, it's easy to kind of almost internalize on a subconscious or unconscious level. Now we're moving to the area where what seems like the common sense statistics doesn't actually pair up with the real statistics. So when you move to a harder difficulty number, things become easier to predict both as a designer and as a player. So it works both directions really, really well. It's I now know that these dice are going to hit pretty consistently in this range. Then we can play in that space. But we can get different experiences even with that, because when we were talking before, we talked about Storypath, like you just mentioned, but also Exalted still uses more or less the same system. It's basically the same probability math as, say, an Aberrant in Trinity, but there's a very different result. So, I mean, I don't know if you want to talk about that a bit.
Yeah, I mean, the result on Exalted is also interesting because for Aberrant or, say Demigod,
Mm-hmm.
uh, we we still keep our dice pools relatively low compared to Exalted.
Mm-hmm.
So, and we also, Exalted has a mechanic that I don't remember in Storypath what happens on tens. They just count as two. No, you re-roll a 10.
Yeah, you reroll 10, whereas
You
in
re-roll a 10.
Exalted,
In
they're doubled.
Exalted, they just count as two successes.
Mm-hmm.
So counting a 10 as two successes is going to give you far more successes than just re-rolling a 10.
Right.
Because it's a 10 gives a guaranteed second success in Exalted, where a 10 gives a 30% chance for a second success, which isn't very high.
Right. So mathematically, a 10 in Storypath is 1.3 successes rather than 2.
Right. So one, Exalted's 10 mechanic gives more successes per 10. And then it's got way more dice, which means you're generating more successes on average per roll.
Mm-hmm.
And so the experience of, say, Exalted versus Aberrant, even though the target number is the same, feels wildly different. The other problem with Exalted is that because you're rolling so many dice, you're expecting, again, to get a lot of successes. But in real life, every single die is its own gremlin. And you may roll 15 ones. I have
Right.
definitely rolled 15 dice and been like, I got a success.
Yes.
That was
so
fun.
amazing.
I'm so good. And it leads to what we call swingy results.
Mm-hmm.
And when we say swingy results, what we mean is you get really big highs and really shitty lows.
Right.
And the probability that you're going to get a really big high and a really shitty low is kind of the same.
Mm-hmm.
D&D also has swingy results.
Right.
Now, I would argue that Exalted swingy results aren't nearly as swingy as D&D's swingy results, because
There's still a curve. It's not still
there's
not
still
that
a
line.
curve, right? It's still a curve, and so you're still going to get those lows, but the target number for the high point is much higher. So you're succeeding 50% of the time in Exalted, and that's pretty good in comparison to D&D, where I don't think you're succeeding 50% of the time. I think it's a much lower number depending on what you're trying to do.
Well,
Although I will say that D&D 5th edition has done a good job of trying to tighten up that math.
Yeah, older editions get wonkier, but I worked at the 5e space recently. The proficiency bonus really helps nudge those numbers over, because in 3.5, without something equivalent, if you had no skill, your chance of hitting, because it says the easy on average is difficulty 10, but in reality it's more like 12 is the number.
Right.
Because D&D says their difficulty numbers below 10, but that's just not true. And so 10 is really your base minimum. So 12 is kind of your early, easy stage. And so that means that you have a 40% chance of succeeding with no, and sometimes you have negatives, so it can even be lower. But with that proficiency bonus starting at +2, you're already bumped right into, okay, I need a 10 or higher, which is that sweet spot.
Right.
That's that 55% chance.
Right.
So, yeah, 5e, just by adding proficiency bonus, quietly nudge the numbers into you're actually pretty competent, even at level 1.
Yep. Yeah, which I was playing a 5e game recently, and I was, of course, it's still swingy because I can still roll below that. It's still half the time I'm gonna, or 45% of the time I'm not gonna get the number I need. So versus, a dice pool system where it's like, well, I've rolled these 3 dice and I've got a 90% chance of getting a success, right? That I will take that 90% chance any day of the week over. I will take the 10% chance of failure any day of the week over a 45% chance of failure.
Right.
Thing. And even if I fail, I feel way less bad about it.
Right.
In that, because it's not happening as often. I feel like I feel, I've played Storypath games, storyteller games, storytelling games, played all of them. I've played D&D in most of its iterations. Oh, I'm old.
I feel you.
And it just, there's no other game where I can just spend round after round after round not doing anything. I mean, that's not true. There are other games that are all based on D20s or a single die.
Well, right.
But there's no other system that allows for that.
And it
as hard.
Yeah, and I do think it's inherited because I've talked about this when I talk about Pugmire, is I'm able to make decisions with Pugmire that D&D just can't make. Even though I'm using it on the same system or the same OGL license, I can just make changes to that system. But because D&D has been around for going on 50 years now, certain people have certain expectations of the game and certain aesthetics of the game. And now we're moving into kind of the arts of mechanics component to a degree, but people expect D&D to feel, and put in air quotes, a certain way, and the math and the randomness needs to be part of that. So
Yes.
if you ever make a D&D game and label it Dungeons and Dragons, and it has multiple dice involved, like Advantage Disadvantage was very controversial when 5e first came out because it felt wrong, right? You roll 1d20. People have slowly adapted to that, but I think that's mainly because Advantage Disadvantage has taken the place of a lot of the bespoke number modifiers in the game, and so it emphasizes, it continues a swinginess that is actually inherent to D&D. D&D is a swingy game by design, and it will always be a swingy game because people expect to be able to ludicrously fumble if you're highly competent, or wildly succeed if you're completely terrible. Those 5% chances at either end need to be there. That's the experience of the game. And so Advantage Disadvantage, you could roll 2 1s, right? And that just feels even worse somehow. So I think it's one of the reasons people have slowly adapted to that, but you're not adding them together. It's not quite the same bell curve, but it is the introduction of a bell curve into D&D, which is something that's never really had before in that particular resolution mechanic.
Right.
But again, when I worked on V20, that was one of the things originally Jess and I talked about, going to a storytelling style of a hard difficulty number. That was early on in the playtest documents. And a lot of people push back on that because to them, World of Darkness in general and Vampire the Masquerade specifically had flexible difficulty numbers. Now, obviously, over time, that's changed. The 5th edition no longer has that. But for an anniversary edition, for celebrating 20 years, a lot of people felt strongly that was the math. And I remember Justin having a conversation with a few of those fans and just like trying to lay out the math, right? It's like, here's why we want to move away from that. And the response we got back was, that's what they remember about the game. They remember they're brouhaha with 8 dice falling flat on his face because they roll a bunch of ones. That swinginess, they have the words for it, but that's what they're saying. Like, that swinginess was to them part of the experience of the World of Darkness, and to them added to the horror because anything can go bad at any time. That was the kind of noir. Okay, every time you pull out a gun and you roll dice, something bad could happen. So it's we see what you're saying here. There's even a base level of competence doesn't mean you will always succeed. Sometimes you can horribly fail. So it's okay, then can we at least put limits on that so that way just ludicrous results are taken off the table. So we kind of shoved it into I think 4 to 9 is the range we actually settled on, because 3 has other slightly more Baroque problems. But ultimately 4 to 9 is kind of a nice range. And then with, like I said, with Storypath, really 7 and 8 are the big sweet spot for that model. You can do 6, but then ultimately what's happened is now you move to every 2 dice gives you success, and that changes a lot of the inherent math. And then 9, we've already talked about it's we're now moving to really functionally every 4 dice gives you success. So 7 to 8 is kind of high end, low end on that eyeballing of 3 dice gives you a success math.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting because I think that some people don't realize how many design decisions are done, one, because of the math involved, make it make sense, but also because of the psychology of people and like what feels good.
Yep.
So, Exalted doesn't need to use as many dice as it does. It doesn't need to, but it does because rolling a handful of dice feels viscerally fun.
Yeah, it feels epic.
It feels epic. And Exalted is trying for this very epic feel of a game, right? Your literal gods who are, exalted into being and doing epic stories and doing wide sweeping stories. And so you want your gameplay to feel just as epic. And so you're rolling buckets of dice because that feels epic.
Mm-hmm.
And no other reason. I mean, not really. They could easily switch to a success system the way Storypath has, where you give, to be honest, Storypath's characters are, I'd venture to say, more competent than an Exalted character because the number of dice is smaller and the swinginess is lower, and the enhancements that we use guarantee additional successes as opposed to give chances for additional successes the way extra dice do. And so while Exalted characters are supposed to be the best at what they do, and they're supposed to be amazing, and they're supposed to be epic, we model that through these dice rolling mechanics that show off that epicness, where an average Storypath character might outroll the shit out of that character because they have a lot of enhancement towards their role.
Right. But on the flip side of that, they also cap out faster than Exalted characters do. And so that's where things like the scale system come into play. That is our kind of scaffolding to get to those Exalted levels of success. It's I'm scale 2 or 3, so I just get even more enhancement to add on the back end to kind of get closer to emulating that. But when you get to people of equal level, what Storypath does is just say, okay, cool, then you're back to normal dice rolling. So we just discount the differences because there aren't differences. And so if you're fighting giant robots fighting, or if you're 2 people in the street fighting, the dice rolls stay exactly the same at that stage.
Right.
Whereas Exalted ultimately just keeps throwing more dice at the problem. And 3rd edition and Essence have found ways to mitigate that. But earlier versions, like Exalted 1st, 2nd edition, and also things like Aberrant 1st edition, and even Scion 1st edition, you had that same instinct, and that led to problems because when you add more dice, there are mathematical complexities, but really the bigger problem is after 20 dice, it's harder. The game slows down. It's hard to hold all the dice in your hands. So there's a tactile component to it. Then you have to count all the successes, and that takes longer. At a certain point in time, it's just harder for brains to process that much information. So you have to like start. People you may not even realize you're doing it until you're doing it. But like if you have a huge pool like that, you'll probably start pulling dice into smaller groups because your brain can't handle looking at 22 dice simultaneously. So it's okay. Let me pull the ones over here. Let me pull the tens over here. You'll almost unconsciously start to group them into smaller groups so your brain can process those smaller groups easier. But that all takes time. That's what sometimes you call in the game industry processing time. There are some games where the game, like one of the advantages D&D has is the processing time is extremely quick. You roll a die, you add a number to it, and you get a result. The processing time is almost as instantaneous as you can get. Whereas if you have games like, say, One Roll System, which is a fantastic game system, but it is definitely a die pool system where you have to figure out how many of the dice are the same, and then how many of those similar dice do you have, and it's called length and width. And you get a ton of information from that roll, but the processing time is much higher. So what happens is you're processing a lot of information at once, and then you're implementing a whole lot of information simultaneously. So it takes about the same amount of time, but each individual roll, you're rolling much less, and each roll gives you more info. So you're getting like all your to hit, your damage, all that, if you will, all in one roll. As opposed to D&D, where it's like, roll this die, add it together. Cool, now roll another die and add it together. Then they have to roll a resistance die. So you're rolling 3 or 4 times, but each of those is a very fast processing time, whereas you can have a die pool that contains information in one. But going back to super large dice pools, when you get to the beyond 20, then you have much more processing time with no inherent mechanic or informational depth that comes with it. So it's just the whole game's taking longer.
Yeah, and that's something that people don't think about, because that's a understanding the player, not understanding the math.
Right.
It's why, I saw on Twitter the other day, somebody was going through this really old game, and they were just like, oh my God, this math and these mechanics. And the mechanics were actually rather simple, but there was multiplication that you had to do after you rolled the die. And then there was like some subtraction and then multiplication. And it was all simple multiplication, simple subtraction and addition. But the processing time to multiply something is much higher than the processing time to add something together. And also the processing time to subtract something is higher than the processing time to add things together.
Yeah.
I don't know why that's true, but it is. So it's easier or better to base your systems on making sure you're adding something to it than to subtract stuff from it. Just because the processing time, the way brains work, is that you're processing faster when you add stuff together. And one of the things that you should be striving for is to reduce processing time at the table. Because if there's too much processing time, I'm not saying that Exalted is beyond the processing time that is fun, because it's not. But if there's too much time to process whether or not you've done well on a roll, people will bounce off the game and not really want to play it.
Right. It'll feel quote unquote complicated.
Right.
And actually, you mentioned older games, and it's a good side comment before I go into it. We have about 10 minutes left, so if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll try to address them in the last 10 minutes we have left as we continue to babble about this stuff. But late 70s, early 80 game design, there was a hot minute where universal tables were very popular. And it was an interesting way to approach the same problem, right? It's we're going to do all of the adding, subtracting math everywhere, put it in a table, and then you just roll dice and cross-reference a couple things. And it's interesting to me that, I feel like that is a game design that has gone out of fashion just because. I think partially because a big, huge table, lots of numbers, looks intimidating. I think it's the big reason why.
It does. Yeah.
But as a way to solve that problem, it's actually not that bad. There are ways around that. My go-to example in this case is the original Marvel Superheroes game from '84 that TSR made. They had a big, huge table, but the results were all color-coded. So rather than seeing a huge table of numbers, it's one row was actually words, adjectives, which helped. So there's only one row of actual numbers. You roll percentile dice. You look for that number in your range. You look over to the word that you're using. You see a red, yellow, or green symbol, or white. And you go, okay, red is bad, green is good. Okay, I mean, it's not really. My point is like, red's actually a really big success. But the point is that you get a color, and you can kind of immediately go, okay, this is the color I want. I need a yellow. Well, I only got a green. Okay, green's below yellow. Boom. And so I think that system has aged better because it removes the numbers that are moving to math. But we, as an aesthetic, as an industry, have moved towards all the math needs to be applied directly to the roll, not the roll applied to another set of results.
Yeah. I have seen some OSR games that have brought back tables because it is definitely an OSR feel
Yeah.
to have tables and tables and tables. And they've brought back some of that, put the math in the table, and you just roll on a table. And I do think that rolling, especially if your table is small enough, and if you have a bunch of different small tables that people might roll on, I do think that there is some fun in the idea of, oh, we're going to roll on a table, and oh, what is my result?
Right.
Like I'm just rolling, I'm getting a number, and I'm going to look at the result, a percentile or whatever. And then we've done all the math for you. I know that the Artus Talsorian games still use lots of tables.
For their life path specifically, yeah.
Yeah, for their life path specifically, but also for their combat system. Like I was reading through The Witcher the other day, and
Okay.
there's hit locations, and they use tables for that, and results, which I'm sure there's math hidden in those tables that I'm not seeing. So
sure, because now that you mention it, because I know Cyberpunk 2020, I don't know if Red still does. It's been a minute since I've looked at Red. But yeah, the hit location, I know the math was based off of the FBI ballistic statistics from shootouts. As like how often is your body part get hit, and they use that math to incorporate into the hit location chart.
that's cool.
So, dumb information I have.
Yeah, there you go. I didn't know that, so that's cool.
But I mean, so math is not inherently a problem. It's kind of where I'm getting to is like, but how humans interpret it is just important. The UI, if you will, of the tabletop role playing game. I keep going back to Phoenix. No, not Phoenix Command. Millennium's End. It's an obscure little game from the late '90s. It was bad in a lot of ways, but one of the things it really did was it had, I mentioned before, the overlays. There's plastic overlays. You just put it over top of a look of your character, and then you can find out where your roll hits. It's the same math, really, because they plot the numbers to where they cluster towards one corner of the circle. So that way, they cluster towards the center, I should say. So odds are when you shoot, someone's going to shoot towards the center of mass, and then you get further and further out. And so the extreme edges tend to hit towards the outsides, and the kind of, it's a percentile game, so the 50-ish range tends to be in the center. Right. So the math still tracks, but also it was done in a way that the higher numbers tend to go towards the top left. So because that's how. Well, there's a lot of really clever math in there, and it's a very easy way to parse. Just drop it down, look for your number on there. The downside of it was you have to look for your one dot in 100 dots on a circle. So that didn't really, the processing time was really low. So it's one of those, this is a clever idea, but then in the actual at the table, it didn't quite work.
Yeah.
There's a question from me in the chat. Did you try to reduce the swinginess of D&D 5e and Pugmire? And if yes, what did you do? Not really. Because Pugmire, part of the reason why I used D&D for Pugmire was one of my goals was I wanted to get the feeling of nostalgia, because these are characters who are remembering a glorious time where humanity was nice to dogs and was good to dogs. And so I wanted that feeling of nostalgia. And so my goal initially when I first made it was to make it not Dungeons and Dragons as it exists, but Dungeons and Dragons as you vaguely remember it being when you first played it when you were in high school. So I'm specifically targeting a very specific older audience. Over time, what I want to do with the game and what other people do with the game has changed, so that instinct has moved away. But now it's a D&D based game, so I'm in that mold. Going back to people expect a certain aesthetic now, so I have to keep that aesthetic. What I did do instead was I moved even more of the math and modifiers into advantage disadvantage. So if you look at D&D 5e, there's still a lot of ad hoc, add +2 here, +2 there. Over time of the edition, they've moved more and more of that away, but the very first books, there's still those bespoke modifiers, because that was the way the game was made. For me, I kept it to, there's an ability modifier. If you add another number, it's always your proficiency modifier. So that does slightly reduce swinginess, because if it's a thing you're good at, to Danielle's point, like, if it's an attribute you're reasonably good at and you have your proficiency bonus, that gives you just a flat number that's going to move into a wider range that's going to consider success. So that does bring swinginess down. And as you go up in level, that confidence is going to continue to increase because your proficiency bonus keeps going up. So it does do that, but I wasn't trying to do that. That was instead more... I recognize that kids in particular get very frustrated with failure. So I want to make sure that success did happen more often, but I could not take swinginess completely off the table. You still had to have that 5% chance of just not making the roll, 5% chance of succeeding no matter what. That always had to be there, so I can never take that out. So in terms of, if you, to use the metaphor, you can't push the swing quite as high, and it can't go back quite as high on the playgrounds, but it is still going back and forth a fair bit. So yes, I guess the last thing I wanted to say was we were giving a lot of, here's the math, and you can kind of use this to predict how it works at the table, but none of this is better than playtesting, because there are always going to be nuances that you can anticipate or model that bringing human beings to the table to parse your mechanics will always, in my experience, improve that.
Absolutely.
And that's going to be our topic for next week, is talking about playtesting, what kinds of playtesting you could do, how that can help you. But I wanted to at least mention here that this is all good for the initial design and also for getting a sense of how it works, but whenever possible, sometimes you can't always play this, but whenever possible, trying to get this in front of people and getting them to try things out is going to give you a better answer no matter what. That's one of the reasons we have the errata phases, for example.
Right.
So did you have anything else you wanted to mention before we wrap things up?
No, I think I've gabbed a whole lot
We have talked
this
a whole
session.
lot about numbers.
Yeah. I get really excited about statistics. Sorry, I'm such a nerd.
That's why I wanted to talk about this about you, because I know you're excited about it, and you're so much better about that than I am, honestly. I'm still very much at the art end of mechanics. It's like, I don't know, this number sounds good.
Yeah.
And then you and I've had conversations, you're like, oh, no, that idea, it's a terrible idea, and this is why. Like, all of the examples I gave you are thought that other people smarter than me have told me this is why this works. Okay, I trust that is why that is. And I just go ahead and move on.
Yeah.
But getting those numbers are always helpful.
Yeah.
So, awesome. Well, then, thank you for hanging out. Everybody else, thanks for hanging out. Thank you for the question in the chat. And we will see you all in 2 weeks to talk about playtesting. So until then,
Yes.
catch y'all later.
Goodbye.
Bye.